Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here with a sewing tutorial today for the Unplugged shorts. These are a loose outer breezy short with an optional compression undershort. The Unplugged features a contoured waistband with a straight or V-shaped bottom for the front or the back, and they can be combined as you choose. The pattern also includes two length options for both the outer and compression shorts, and you can choose between hemming or a binding option. Before you start cutting, you'll need to decide which waistband options you'd like to make. There are 4 combinations that you can choose from: a V back with a V front, a V back with a straight front, a straight back with a V front, or a straight back with a straight front. Make your choice and then make a note of it because this will affect how you cut the rest of your pieces. For my shorts, I've chosen the V back and the straight front. You'll need to cut the outer and inner piece, so C1 and C2 for the back, C7 and C8 for the front. Be sure to mark the notches on the front pieces and cut along the higher or lower rise marking on the pattern piece. The higher rise pieces are shown here. You'll need piece P1, the front main outer short. This is the hemmed version shown. Be sure to mark the notches and choose between the longer or shorter length, and also make sure to use the correct cut line at the top of the pattern piece that matches your front waistband of choice. And here's a quick look at the binding version. You'll see the edges are more curved, you'll still have top notches, and you'll still need to match the top cut line and the bottom cut line with your waistband and hem length of choice. Cut 2 of piece P2, the back main, as mirror images. Again, this is the hemmed version shown, and again, make sure your top cut line matches your back waistband choice. Choose either the longer or shorter hem length. This is the shorter hem length shown. This is what your back main will look like if you're doing the binding version. Again, the edges will be more curved. You'll still need to match the top edge cut line and the bottom cut line with your waistband and hem of choice. If you're making the binding version, cut out 2 pieces according to this chart, which can also be found on page 9 of the tutorial. For the optional inner shorts, cut 2 of H1 as mirror images, making sure that top cut line matches your waistband front. Choose between a longer or shorter length and make sure to mark those notches. Cut 2 of the inner shorts back main as a mirror images. Choose again between the longer or shorter length. Make sure to mark those notches and double check that top line so that your cut line matches your back waistband of choice. In addition, if you're going to use the optional gusset, you'll cut along the gusset cut line. If not, cut along the outer cut line. For piece H3, the inner short side panel, cut 2 as mirror images. Use the V waistband cut line if your front waistband is a V waistband, and make sure to mark those notches. Cut 2 of piece H4, the side panel pocket piece. For any beginners out there, this is the piece that will be on the outside of the pocket. You'll hem the top, and this is the bit that will show the most on the outside. Cut 2 as mirror images and make sure to mark those notches. For the optional inner shorts gusset, cut 2 of the gusset piece as mirror images. I like to stick mine together with wash away adhesive tape before cutting and cut them out as one piece, already stuck together. Follow along here if you're making the binding version, or skip ahead to the section entitled Hemmed version if you're making that one. With right sides together, place the front main onto the back main, lining them up at the inseam. Pin in place and stitch with a stretch stitch or serger in a 3/8 inch seam allowance. With a stretch woven, I did use a straight stitch on these seams and that worked perfectly fine. Open up the piece and press the seam allowance open. We'll now add the binding to the bottom edge. We will attach the binding to the shorts with right sides together. At this point, you can pin in place all the way across, but since there's no stretching involved, you can also attach it freehand without pinning. With right sides together, line up the raw edges and stitch with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And what I mean by scant is you want to go exactly 3/8 of an inch or just a hair smaller than 3/8 of an inch. You do not want to go over 3/8 of an inch. Attach the binding at a 1-to-1 ratio so nothing is being stretched. If you have a little bit of excess binding, that's okay. We'll clip that off after the next step. Now we'll begin to double fold the binding up to enclose that seam allowance. Fold the raw edge of the binding up toward the seam allowance to meet it, and then fold it up a second time just until you pass or cover up the seam line on the wrong side of the fabric. And this is where the scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance comes into play. If you've taken too large of a seam allowance, then you won't have enough room to fold up the bottom of that binding. So if you find that is happening to you, you can simply trim away 1/8 of an inch of the seam allowance. If you've used your serger to attach the binding, your serger will have already trimmed away part of that, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just if you use a sewing machine and you find that that seam allowance is a little too fat for you to do the double fold, trimming away may be helpful. Another option would be to use some of this wash away wonder tape or wash away adhesive tape. You can place that onto the seam allowance. It's a double-sided sticky tape that washes away when you first put your garment into the wash. And it's really nice because you can do your double fold and then your binding will just stick to that seam allowance. Continue with the double fold all the way across and repeat with the other leg. When finished pinning, your leg will look something like this. I am definitely a firm believer in more is more when it comes to clipping binding. If you have any extra binding hanging off the end at this point, you can clip it off. Top stitch the binding in place. You will stitch close to the seam of the binding, making sure to capture that fold on the wrong side. I'll be using a straight stitch on my sewing machine. You can use a regular straight stitch, especially if you're using a less stretch fabric such as this stretch woven, or you can use a slightly lengthened straight stitch if you are using a knit fabric. But this hem should not be stretched at all, so a straight stitch should work fine. Another option would be to use your cover stitch machine. And here's how it'll look when it's done. Stitching close to that seam, it looks like the back fold pulled away from that original seam a little bit, but as long as I caught the back fold with my top stitching and it looks nice from the outside, I am satisfied. Complete the binding steps for both leg pieces and then lay them out onto your table with right sides up. Take one of the legs and lay it with right sides down on top of the other. Line them up and pin or clip along the crotch seam. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. As you can see, I have used my serger for this seam. Once that crotch seam is stitched, you will open everything up so that it is right sides facing up on your table. Refold the shorts along that crotch seam so that everything is right sides facing out and the side seams are aligned. Rearrange the shorts as needed so that you can access the side seam. I like to use my acrylic ruler in between the layers of the shorts to use as a hard pinning surface. For reference, my shorts are laying with the back side facing up towards the camera. Fold the front side seam over the back, overlapping by a total of 3/4 inches, so the bindings will be overlapped but laying edge to edge, not on top of each other. Pin in place from the top all the way down to the bottom where the two pieces begin to diverge. Repeat for the other side, remembering that the front folds over the back. top stitch in place along the outer edge of the binding, all the way to the bottom again where the front and back begin to diverge. I'll be using a straight stitch to match the top stitching that I used to attach the binding. Repeat for the other side seam, and this is how your shorts will look so far. Now skip ahead to the optional inner shorts or the waistband. Place your front and back outer pieces on the table with right sides facing up. Flip the front main piece onto the back main piece so that right sides are now touching each other, and line up the two pieces at that small inseam. Pin or clip the two pieces together along the inseam, again with right sides touching, and we're going to stitch both pair with stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that the inseams are stitched, we'll line up both pieces with right sides together along the crotch seam. Pin or clip in place along that U-shaped crotch seam. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Back at our table, we're going to open everything up so all right sides are facing up, and we're going to refold so that the side seams are lined up at the front and the back. Pin or clip along the side seams. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're using the optional gusset, first baste your two gusset pieces together. Bring them over to the back shorts and make sure you have cut along the gusset cut line. With right sides touching, line up the gusset right along that gusset cut line at the bottom of the back crotch seam and pin in place. A tiny little dog ear will be sticking out the bottom of the back shorts. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you start at the bottom like I've done, just serge off after you pass the top of the gusset. Open out the gusset and it will look like this. At this point you can top stitch right along the edge of the gusset right here, but I'll be skipping that step today. Lay both back pieces on your table with right sides facing up and make sure to open out that gusset. Flip one of the pieces over onto the other so that right sides are touching, and line up the two pieces along that back crotch seam. The raw edge of your gusset now becomes the bottom of one of the back crotch seams. Pin or clip in place and then stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure to take the full seam allowance when you get to the top of that gusset. Now let's construct the pocket piece. We'll start by hemming the side panel pocket piece H4. This is the smaller pocket piece. Fold the top down 1 inch toward the wrong side, pin or clip in place, and then we will top stitch using a zigzag stitch, twin needle, or cover stitch. You'll be top stitching from the right side of the fabric with the fold edge underneath. Use your needle plate and your fingers to guide you to follow along that raw edge in the back. Once both H4 pieces are hemmed at the top, we'll lay them on top of piece H3. All of these pieces are with right sides facing up right now. Make sure to line up the notches, pin or clip in place, and we're going to baste the two pieces together. Baste using a straight stitch on your sewing machine set to the longest possible stitch length. Back at the table, we have our back piece with right sides facing up, and we have our side panel pieces with right sides facing up. Lay them next to each other so that the double notches are aligned, and then flip the pocket piece onto the back piece so that right sides are touching, notches and raw edges are aligned. Pin both side panel pocket pieces to the back piece. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now, with everything again right sides facing up on our table, we'll bring over our front pieces with right sides up, line up the single notches, then we'll flip over the front piece onto the side panel, lining up the raw edges and the single notches. Pin or clip in place. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now fold the shorts with right sides touching, lining them up at the center front crotch seam. Pin or clip in place, and we are going to stitch again with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once stitched, they will look like this. And now we're going to refold the shorts so that the inseams are aligned. We'll pin or clip all along the inseam. If you use the gusset, the center of the back gusset will align with the center front crotch seam. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Hem the shorts by turning them up 1 inch to the wrong side and pinning or clipping in place. Top stitch that hem using a zigzag stitch, twin needle, or cover stitch machine. With the right side of both shorts facing outward, we're going to place the inner shorts inside of the outer shorts. Line them up at the center front and center back and pin or clip in place. You may also find it helpful to find the quarter points on the sides of each shorts and pin or clip them in that spot as well. You will notice that the inner shorts will need to be stretched as you baste the shorts together along the top edge. Baste along the top edge while stretching the inner shorts just enough so that there are no wrinkles or folds in the outer short as you stitch. And use your fingers to help make sure that those two raw edges stay aligned. Now let's construct the waistband. Keep in mind that your waistband choices may look different than mine. I had the straight front and the V-shaped back. We're going to clip the inner pieces together and the outer pieces together. So here I have the outer front and the outer back with right sides touching. Clip or pin along the side seams and do the same with the inner front and the inner back. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We suggest you use a sewing machine for this step so that you can open up the seam allowance. It'll give a nice clean and flatter finish on the side of your waistband. With the side seams stitched, we'll take one waistband and turn it with right sides facing outward, and we'll slip that waistband inside of the other so that they are right sides touching. pin or clip along the top edge, and this is where you can line up those side seams and open up those sewing machine stitches to get a nice clean finish. If you did use a serger for those side seams, you'll simply nest them by pushing one side seam toward the front and one side seam toward the back. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Optionally, you can add a length of 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch elastic to that seam allowance. This is the main fabric on top. You'll want to stitch the elastic to the main fabric side of that seam allowance. The thing you'll want to keep in mind is to keep the elastic on the right side or the seam allowance side of that stitch line. I do not need that extra support to keep my waistband up, so I will skip the elastic, but what I will do is understitch the seam allowance to the inner layer of the waistband. So I have the inner layer of the waistband on the right side there. The seam allowance is pushed to the right so that the seam allowance is over the inner waistband, and I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch or very close to that stitch line, making sure to use a stretch stitch. I'll be using the lightning bolt stitch, but the triple straight would also be a good option here. And again, just to clarify, I am stitching over both layers of the seam allowance and also the inner waistband layer. The purpose of understitching is just to keep that seam from peeking out toward the front of the pants. We already have an inner waistband that's slightly shorter than the outer, and that will help pull the inner waistband toward the inside, but this will just ensure that and make it even neater. Okay, and here we have the inside of the outer waistband on the far left. Here's the main stitch line of the two waistbands, and then we have the under stitch line here. And then when we turn everything right side out, here's the outer with no seam or stitches, and then from the inside you can see the seam and the under stitch line. This will stay nice and neat on the inside of your waistband. Now with the waistband turned right side out, we'll align those bottom edges so wrong sides are touching, pin or clip in place, so that we can baste all along that bottom edge. We're going to now pin the waistband to the shorts with right sides touching, making sure to align the front notches. My shorts are wrong side out, and the waistband has the outer or right side facing outward, so that way the right sides are touching. Pin at the center front notches, pin at the side seams, and find the center of the back and pin there as well. Use additional pins or clips as needed. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When using the V waistband option, I like to use the V point as my starting point and stitch a straight line on right at that point and using a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the start. Another tip to sewing this waistband is to keep in mind that the outer short is on the inside layer and it is gathered. So what you want to do as you're stitching this waistband is stretch the waistband just enough to straighten out those gathers. The reason you want to do that is because if you don't, some of those gathers might appear as folds underneath your waistband after you finish stitching. And then once you get to the other end of that V, you're just going to stitch a straight line off, maintaining the 3/8 inch seam allowance until you come off the fabric. If you're doing the hemmed version, your final step will be to hem that outer short. Do so by turning it under 1/2 inch toward the wrong side. You can pin or clip it in place, but if you're feeling wild like I am, you can just wing it. Top stitch that hem using a zigzag stitch, twin needle, or cover stitch machine. And with that, you have completed your very own Greenstyle Unplugged shorts. Now you can go out and wear and enjoy your unplugged shorts while doing all the things. Please share your makes on social media using hashtag #GSUnpluggedShorts. We can't wait to see your makes. Until next time, happy sewing from all of us at Greenstyle.